This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
While I watch your interviews, I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said fine. I didn't negotiate with him, and I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell, and how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right? One of the president's most senior economic advisors is Brian Deese, who heads the National Economic Council at the White House. I recently had a chance to sit down with Brian to talk about interest rates, inflation, and the general state of the economy in the United States and around the world. So let me ask you the first and most important question. Are we going to go into a recession anytime in the foreseeable future?
Well, thank you for having me. And I thought we were going to start on a rosy note, but I should have expected nothing less. All joking aside, thank you for having me, and thank you for putting this together. We are no doubt in uncertain times, but I think that if you look at the U.S. economy, my perspective, the most striking feature of the U.S. economy right now is resilience, the resilience of households and consumer balance sheets, the resilience of business and business investment, and globally, the resilience of the U.S. economy in an uncertain global environment. So we're certainly in a complicated and in many ways unprecedented transition, but I think that there's every reason to have a lot of confidence in the U.S. Position in the context of a globally uncertain environment.
I'll take that as maybe, you don't know. Well, let me ask you an easier question.
Yeah, please.
All right.
I'll take any out you want to give me.
You think England is, and you think the UK is in a recession?
Well, I think the situation in Europe and the UK is very, very difficult right now. They face a very difficult situation, and they are, as I was saying, in terms of the U.S. position, they're significantly more exposed to the energy price volatility, and they don't have some of the incumbent strengths that we have here economically. So I think it is and is going to be a tough period for the UK and for the European Union.
Normally, in the United States, when you cut taxes, it's designed to stimulate the economy, and that's what happened in Britain. They announced cutting taxes to stimulate the economy, but it's had seems to be unfortunate impact on the British economy. The stock market's gone down, and people are very upset about it. Are you surprised about that?
I wasn't surprised with the market reaction. I think that if we, you have to, any economic policy has to be in the context of the situation that we are in. And in a monetary tightening cycle like this, the challenge with that policy aperture is it just puts the monetary authority in a position of potentially having to move even tighter. I think that that's what you saw in the reaction. And also, I would say it is important, particularly important, to maintain a focus on fiscal prudence, fiscal discipline. It's certainly something that we have been focused on here, and the markets take notice.
So let's talk about another easy subject, inflation. Inflation is as high as it's been since I was in government. I managed to get a higher rate than you've gotten so far, but I wanted to know, in your view, is inflation now coming down a bit as a result of the Fed's hiking, and do you expect the Fed to continue to hike in the November and December FOMC meetings?
Well, the good news is the second part of your question is the easy one, as you know, because part of respecting the independence of the Fed is leaving to them.
Just ask if you expect.
Look, the market expects that, and
All right, okay.
I don't have any wisdom beyond that. I think, but if you look at most of the data points over the course of the last couple of months, we've certainly seen headline inflation on a month-over-month basis slow dramatically. Basically, it's been flat for the last couple of months. That's a function of the fact that we've seen energy prices come down, gas prices, and that's offset price increases elsewhere. But I think if you look broadly across the economy, you are seeing a number of places where you're seeing this shift and this transition happen in real time. Commodity prices have come off. You've seen that in a number of durable goods segments. And at the same time, as you know, this process operates with some lags, and so that's why, even as you look over the course of the last couple of months, you've got to really, even at a moment of heightened uncertainty that we are in right now, have to do whatever we can to lift up from individual monthly data points.
Now, when I went to college many years ago, the standard textbook said that inflation was on average 3 or 4% a year. That was relatively normal. For the last 25 years, we've had 2% inflation, and so we've gotten used to 2% inflation. My children have never seen higher inflation. But the Fed now says they want to get inflation back to 2%, which is what it was. But why not 3 or 4%? Why does 2% have to be a goal? And how hard is it going to be to get down to 2% without putting unemployment up to 6% or higher?
You know, a big part of inflation is expectations. And the risk with inflation is not only the immediate impact on purchasing power, but also the risk that expectations get unmoored, get unanchored, and then it gets much more difficult to bring inflation down. So when you ask that question about bringing down to a level, I think one of the most important questions is the shape of policy focused on making sure that we don't lose control of those expectations. That's obviously something that the Fed keeps a close eye on. And so, to your question of the process, look, I am fundamentally optimistic about the American economy, and I'm optimistic that we can navigate through this transition in a way where we come out of this as a country and as an economy in a stronger position than when the pandemic hit. So yeah, at core, I do believe that there's no certainty in any way, or no way inevitable that we're going into a downturn.
For people who live in Washington, politicians, is it more difficult when unemployment is going up or when inflation is going up? Inflation affects everybody, unemployment doesn't affect everybody. So how do you weigh the political trade-off between unemployment going up and inflation going up? Which is more difficult for politicians or for, let's say, the administration?
There's no question that inflation affects everybody, and it affects it affects the psyche. And I think that when it affects a sense, I think also of people's sentiment and a sense in which things are, in or out of control, and we see that in consumer sentiment data. At the same time, we also, as you asked the question about on the political side, as economic policymakers need to recognize that the way that economists think about inflation and the way that Americans think about inflation often differs, that we have this idea of headline inflation versus core, and economists say you really should pay less attention to headline because it has food and gas. You ask typical people what inflation is, it's food and gas. And so, understanding the interplay between the economics and the politics of inflation is something that we haven't been as used to.
So let me go back to the NEC. The NEC was started under President Clinton, and Bob Rubin was the first person to hold that job. Can you explain to people what it actually does and what the NEC does day to day? For example, who's in the NEC, who's on the NEC, what is your job actually to do?
So the National Economic Council, the job, the mandate, the mission of the organization is to coordinate economic policy across the executive branch and across the cabinet to make sure that the president is getting the benefit of when making decisions of his entire economic cabinet, and also that the economic cabinet is getting clear direction from the president as well. So that two ways. So it's a coordination function. On the NEC itself are all of the relevant cabinet members, the sort of core economic team, OMB, Council of Economic Advisors, Treasury, but also Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Commerce. My team, the NEC team, is a small team within the White House our job is to do that coordination across the range of economic policy issues.
Now, you were the deputy in the Obama administration at the NEC, now you're the director. Which NEC worked better, the Obama administration one or the Biden one?
Well, on the issues that I worked on in the Obama administration, it worked very, very well. Okay. And the current NEC works very well as well. So it's that subset of the ones I didn't work on.
Okay, let's talk about your own background for a moment. I mentioned before you grew up in Boston area. And what did your family do? Were they in business, academics, politics, important things like private equity? Did they do that?
My father's an educator. He teaches, and my mother is a civil engineer by training and worked as an environmental engineer.
Okay, so you went to Middlebury, and what did you study there?
I studied political science and economics with an international focus.
Okay, and after you graduated, what did you do then?
I came here to D.C. on a fellowship to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I was doing international economics, international economic development. I had spent the better part of a year in Argentina in 1999, right before the collapse there. Became fascinated with trade and development issues, and so I came here to D.C. and
the Argentinian economy collapsed while you were there?
No, right after I left.
Right after you left. Okay, right after you left. Okay, you got out.
Correlation and causation.
Okay. All right, so then you came back to Washington to do what?
So I stayed here. I worked. I sort of shifted from international policy, economic policy, domestic policy. Then I went to law school, left D.C., and I came back here.
So you went to law school to be a lawyer or not?
I went to law school no, not to be a lawyer, but because I was fascinated as I was working on the more economic elements. It became clear that most of policy is actually understanding law in different ways, and so I went with the idea that I would continue to work in policy, but
okay. So you didn't want to practice law ever?
Wasn't my objective.
Okay. So how did you get involved with the Obama administration? Did you volunteer in the campaign, or how did you get involved in the campaign or the administration?
So I started working on the 2007-2008 campaign. I actually worked for. I had the most important experience. I campaigned against candidate Obama for about 9 months, working for Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton. And then after they lost, I was fortunate enough to then join the Obama campaign in campaign for.
And what did then Senator Obama say about that?
The good news was I was junior enough in the campaign that
He didn't
Senator
pay
Obama
attention.
was, I don't think, particularly aware of my transition to his campaign at the time.
So he got elected, and then you got his position as Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy. And what was the biggest thing that you accomplished during the Obama administration in your view?
My first project upon coming into government was to work as part of the team that did the restructuring of General Motors and Chrysler, as well as the finance companies as well. And so that was basically from, many of you will recall, November, December of 2008, right through to the summer of 2009. That was my overriding focus.
So after the Obama administration, you joined the dark side of money management, and you worked for BlackRock, but in charge of global sustainability. So what does that really mean? What were you doing at BlackRock?
So two things. One was trying to actually do financial research to understand what are drivers of long-term economic performance that are financially relevant, but that may not be on the mind of traditional investors. To give you a concrete example, one of the most persistent measures of financial performance, uncorrelated, is the rate of change at which a company brings down its carbon emissions. Not just the level of carbon emissions, but the rate of change of doing so. And we did a lot of research around that to find that is in part because it is an uncorrelated measure of operational performance. Better management teams actually better manage against that. And so that becomes the kind of thing that you can invest against, but it also expands the universe of what investors are thinking about.
So when President Biden was starting to run for president, you knew him when he was vice president. You were in the Obama administration. Did you support him? Were you working the campaign for then Vice President Biden, or did you work for somebody else?
So I was for most of that time I was busy. I had a job, had a family. I would anytime anyone called, I would offer the opinions and
So
advice.
when did you actually get involved with the Biden people? Was it after he won the election that they asked you to help with the transition?
So I did some work in volunteering to help on the developing some elements of the platform during 2020. that came together in sort of his general election economic policy.
White House staff jobs are notoriously long-houred, and you have 2 little children. So how do you manage your time, and how come you have no gray hair as a result of working these long hours in 2 administrations?
If the camera gets close enough, you'll see some. It's a constant challenge, and I don't have particular wisdom or insight into how to answer it, other than, needing to be extremely efficient with the time that you have, hire great staff, and build a great team. I've got an extraordinary NEC team and core team inside the White House, without which I wouldn't be able to do this. But it also takes an understanding family, because no matter how good you are at prioritization, time management, and productivity with your own time, there is always something that happens, and always something that comes up.
Well, your children are young, so do you go to PTA meetings and people give you economic advice at the PTA meetings? So they kind of say, I have an idea for you on fighting inflation. Does that ever happen?
People are extraordinarily generous with their advice.
Really? What would you like to do most in economic policy in the next 2 years?
The first and most important thing that we're gripped by and focused on now is effectively implementing this historic set of legislation that we have accomplished.
So recently we had an act passed called the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, who came up with that name, really?
It's a great name.
I guess so, but you really think it's going to reduce inflation? It seemed like it was spending a lot of money, and how is inflation going to be reduced by that?
See, it's because it's the Inflation Reduction Act. Joking aside, I actually think that it is an appropriate name, and it goes to the structure of if I could say it in a wonky way, the role of fiscal policy in a period of monetary tightening. What you want to do is you want to take measures that will lower costs for individuals and do it in a way that lowers the federal deficit. Because if you're lowering the federal deficit at the same time that you're lowering costs for individuals, then you're actually operating in the same direction. Now, that's complicated to do from a policy perspective, but that is exactly what the Inflation Reduction Act accomplished.
But does it really lower federal debt and federal deficit? Because I thought it was just lowering it below where it would otherwise have been, but it's not actually producing a net reduction in federal debt, is it? It's reducing it below where the policy people said it would have otherwise been, right?
So the appropriate way to judge any piece of legislation is it going to reduce or increase the deficit compared to the baseline at the time? And the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce the deficit compared to the baseline by, about $260 billion, depending in the first decade, probably more than $1 trillion in the second decade. And importantly, it does it in ways like, probably the simplest way to understand is the provision that allows Medicare to, for the first time, negotiate for better prices for prescription drugs. That will mean that Medicare is spending less money on drugs. That will lower federal spending. But it will also lower the cost of drugs to Medicare recipients and also to recipients in the private market, since Medicare is such a large purchaser.
Okay. In the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the tax increases that the president had previously proposed in the Build Back Better Act did not get in there. Are those tax increases off the table for the remainder of the Biden term, or you're not precluded from?
Those are policies the president thought made sense, would have supported if they were in the legislation, and continues to support going forward. And I will say, even for all the things that weren't in there, one of the reasons, to go back to your previous question, why that bill reduces the deficit and actually helps in reducing inflation across time is that what is in there, for example, is a new 15% minimum tax, book minimum tax for the largest corporations, those with over $1 billion in earnings. I think that that's the kind of reasonable, common sense tax reform that makes sense. It does mean that some people will pay more in taxes, but certainly that kind of base broadening reform, there's a lot of important sensibility to it.
On the day that the Inflation Reduction Act was signed, record high inflation numbers came out. So did you ever consider maybe adjusting the schedule of the signing ceremony, or was it something you said that who told the president the numbers were going to be that high that morning, and maybe you should change the signing ceremony?
I think that that number and others go to how people are experiencing inflation today, because one of the principal reasons why that headline number was basically flat was because in the month prior, gas prices had come down by a very significant amount. And that is really important for typical Americans' monthly balance sheets, but it also is important because it's one of the most visible price signals in our economy.
Now you're almost 2 years into this administration, and you expect to stay for another 2 years. I think, in other words, it's a long 2 years, so you're not worn out, and you could see doing this for another 2 years at least, if not more.
I've got no plans to leave, and I've got my head down, and certainly fully absorbed in the work we're doing.
So in the next 2 years, let's suppose you control Congress. What you'd like to do most in economic policy in the next 2 years? What would be your highest goal, other than getting inflation down and unemployment, keeping it at a reasonable level? Is there another type of CHIPS Act or some other major piece of legislation that you want to get through?
Look, I think there's a number of priorities that I would love to see us make more progress on. I'll answer your question, but as an aside, the first and most important thing that we're gripped by and focused on now is effectively implementing this historic set of legislation that we have accomplished. The implementation of this, to your point about CHIPS and otherwise, the effective implementation across the board is going to make a difference, a big difference in terms of the broader economic impact. But look, I think we need to make more progress on tax reform. We made some steps here, but it's showing that we can, as a country, effectively fund our priorities and also build fairness into the tax code is important. It's important for trust. It's important for strengthening our democratic institutions. We need to make more progress on underscoring that issues that often get referenced as care or the care economy are not social issues. They're core economic issues. They're core to our labor force. They're core to our productivity as a country. And there's other issues that are now coming to floor, like housing and housing costs. The fact that we have persistent undersupply of affordable housing in this country is a policy choice decades in the making. We could do something about that, and now is a really important time to do that given the period in the monetary policy cycle. There's a number of places where we can make progress, places where there is a lot of actual bipartisan support. So I could go through a much longer list if you give me time.
So what's the greatest pleasure of your job, and what's the worst part of your job, other than interviewing like this? But what's the greatest pleasure, and what's the greatest less pleasurable part?
So, having gone in and out and being in a couple administrations, by far the greatest pleasure is the people. You spend so much time with them, but also the quality of people that can come. A White House in a sense, it's a terrible place to work. It's very hard and all the like, but it's also a place where the reservation price or the wage that you would pay is negative because everybody wants to come and have an opportunity, so you can attract great people, diverse people with diverse backgrounds and extraordinary things to bear. So you make friendships and bonds with people, and so that's at core the best.
What's the worst part?
The best part. I think the most challenging part is that your time is never your own. That you have to be prepared that something always can happen, and usually something does happen.